+8 to everything and healing, -8 attack, speed, and defense on the foe, which is effectively +8 to everything and healing, +8 to everything and healing. If there's one thing that really annoys me sometimes about Fae, is that when it comes to just getting a refine or any sort of brand new weapon in the game, there tends to be overlap with a lot of pre-existing stuff. And that isn't me talking about like inheritables, because I think having inheritables with good effects is a good thing. So like, I'm not gonna knock Coral Saber or Arcane Sword for like guaranteed follow-up with XYZ and then go be like, oh yeah, and Divine Tear Fang is guaranteed follow-up, because no, that's not what I mean by that. I mean more in the sense that if a unit is really going to get a refine, I personally would like it if they had it a bit more unique, something they could call their own. And that isn't to say I don't want to see any sort of overlap in general, but I also don't want to see a copy and paste scenario where you're basically taking the same weapon 2 or 3 times, putting it over several units across a span of who knows how long, and calling it a day. Because honestly, even if the effect can be good or is pretty decent for what it is, I honestly find that's just kind of boring. I don't think it's really an issue in terms of just the overall health of the game or whatever. To be honest, this could really just be a nothing thing, because to be fair, it is basically just a mobile game with PNGs and all that. But I do think that if a unit is due for a refine, or is going to get a new weapon, then I do think it's at least giving some sort of twist to their refine, to the point where at least only they can do certain things that other units can't. Not necessarily everything, but a good amount of stuff that other units can do, well, they can't, because whether that's their class type, or it has to do with their stat lines, or whatever the case may be. And I'll go into that in a bit, but for now I just want to talk about the perspective of it all, because this issue really went back as far as the initial refine batches of 2018. And to be fair, I'm willing to cut them some slack for this, because this is when refines were first starting out, and it was basically just their base effect for the most part, and then like whatever inheritable skill that was already available, and that was literally it. It wasn't really as diverse as we get nowadays, but it was still there. So like even back then we had stuff like Lonku and Linus basically sharing the same weapon with Life and Death and Slaying, with Cordelia and Alencia, who had a player phase brave weapon with -2 speed and then just an attack speed boost. And a bit off topic for a second, it just felt weird that Cordelia had an HP condition while Alencia had a player phase condition. It just felt really unnecessary, but even that aside, it's basically the same thing. And because of that, a lot of weapons just tended to overlap. And again, this was a 2018 semi-2019 thing, so they have been improving on the quality and just diversity of refines ever since, and I'm going to give credit where it's due. I think they've been doing a generally better job when it comes to a lot of units, but obviously the issue still exists because they still continue to do stuff like that. So even though this doesn't exactly fall into the same category, we have Thea and the recently released Holst. They both have a bonus doubler PRF with Garden stats. And while Thea does have her visible attack defense buff at the start of every turn, it's basically the same weapon. It's not, I don't really find them to be as unique. And to be fair, Thea wasn't exactly like the most groundbreaking unit when it came to the refine either. It just felt a bit more unique in that regard because flyers can't get bonus doubler, so I found that in that regard it was pretty cool. And to be honest, I don't have a problem with overlap in general. I do think it is fine if the effects are unique, or they aren't oversaturated, or they're provided to an archetype that just can't get the effects in general. So I think two great examples of that would be like dual phase brave units and maybe even Ike versus Black Knight. Going to the dual phase brave for a second, we do have a lot more accessible options nowadays, especially through the Grail pool. We have Finn, Arden, and recently Har, who also got a dual phase brave refine. But even though they all have the same similar base effect, I do find that because of their archetypes and because of the effects that they also have in tandem with the dual phase brave, that they are a lot more unique in that regard. So even if they're all able to just attack twice regardless of phase, Finn, for example, has 3 movement, so he can just get into combat and run away because he has stuff like Trace, and he does that really, really well. You have Har, who has his true damage reduction, but also has no weakness to anything that targets his physical defense because he also has Iot Shield. But he is weak to blue tomes, but that didn't really matter too much because his res isn't exactly the highest anyway. And honestly, that is really, really cool because if you were to just make him into a Vantage unit, for example, he's not going to fall to bows anytime soon. Even if he still had his bow weakness, he still had the true damage reduction, so it was probably going to get soaked anyway. So we could always just set advantage that way, and then whenever Squishy Mage tries to initiate on him, if they don't have Hardy Bearing or Sweep, he can just kill them in 1 or 2 hits, which is really, really cool. And in Arden being in armor, he could just act as a near save or far save, depending on what you really want to do with him. Near save is definitely a lot more potent, but even with that being the case, they all have different movement types. They all have different effects going for them, even though Arden is still just guard and stats. He is in armor, meaning that his playstyle is still going to be a lot more different comparatively to the other two. Which is why I do think overlap is fine if you can provide it to a unique setting. So even Ike and Black Knight, for example, they literally have the same weapon. Distant Counter, Slaying, Spectrum 4. But I do think in their case it's also a bit different. Black Knight still has his armor status while Ike is infantry, so they all have their own set of unique purposes and niches. Black Knight is still definitely a bit more potent because armors are pretty much just cheat units nowadays. You can act as a near save, or you could try and do far save, but I don't think Black Knight is really going to be doing too well as a far save unless you replace his weapon with Arcane or any other sort of inheritable. But even that aside, he also has Black Luna, which doesn't really help with the comparison because it basically makes him a bit more unique. But even with that being the case, Ike also has his Radiant Aether 2, well, the legendary one at least, so he could always just loop for healing, while as Black Knight could always loop for damage output, which is pretty unique in its own right. I probably shouldn't have chose 2 units with PRF skills, but I do think for argument's sake, they do have the same weapon, so it was worth talking about regardless. And honestly, again, I do think that if they were to just rinse and repeat certain weapons and refines, they need to provide something unique. But I also would like to see just unique things in general. And I don't expect every single refine to have a brand new effect or something we've never seen ever, because I think that's asking too much. But I honestly do think one of my favorite refines of this year, or just 2 refines this year, were Makoto and Wallheart. I think Wallheart was this year. But Makoto had the first ever Canto control, which we ended up getting as an inheritable skill for all infantry later that month, I believe, through Medius, or it was the month after, but it was pretty close. But at the time, it was basically a brand new unique effect that was basically an answer to the likes of Canto. And while you could argue it wasn't exactly at its full potential because it was locked to Makoto, it was still something we've never really seen before, and it was really, really cool in that regard. And to be fair, you could still argue that because Makoto has her flash effect and all that stuff in a free C slot, that she could still provide a bit more utility than a lot of other units with the likes of Cancel Control in their C slot, but that's neither here nor there. We also had Wallheart, who has his Super Menace Flash, which is really cool. And even though it does get messed up by the likes of near saves, if they just aren't in range, it can still protect the targeted ally. It's still something that we just don't see too often, and it's just a breath of fresh air overall, which is why I really do like it. And even then, it's like, Wallheart is still a really good unit, especially in stuff like Summoner Duels, where you can't really use both near and far save, so a lot of the time people are going to be bringing far save, because a lot of the big threats tend to be ranged anyway. But even then, I like seeing unique stuff. I think it just adds some level of creativity and freshness to the game that I think we're missing a bit of. But again, I do think they're doing a bit better overall, because refines nowadays compared to back then, it's definitely a lot better, but you can definitely still see an overlap. And outside of that, there is the matter of Arcanes, which is basically just an inheritable PRF. I think Arcanes are wonderful for the game because it just helps out a lot of older units or units that just didn't have PRFs or can't get PRFs because they're seasonals, just the function. And in that regard, I don't think it's really that much of an issue if every single unit could use Arcanes, because even though it's basically an inheritable PRF, it's still an inheritable that basically does have its own fair share of benefits and drawbacks for each and every unit. Even though it does become a matter of stat comparisons and class archetypes, I find that it's a bit different in that regard compared to just getting a personal weapon to call your own. But still, Arcanes, really great stuff. I really like to see them, and I'm hopeful that the future ones are just going to be as good, if not better, because I do think this has a lot of potential. But overall, I would just like to see more unique refines that isn't just stats and then copy paste effect, unless they were to do it in a way where it's unique to the individual user. But at the same time, I'm not also asking for like, oh, now you need 6 effects in this weapon, because the weapon before had 2 effects or 3 effects, and if you don't give them an extra effect, then it's basically just the same weapon. That's not really what I'm trying to say. It's more like I want to see something unique that allows even units that don't get necessarily a great refine, just something that allows them to stand out in their own regard and just basically say, yeah, I can do this, but most of these other units can't, so why not choose me? And outside of that, there's really not much else to say on it. I just want to see more unique stuff. And I don't know if I'm really alone in that regard, or maybe I'm being a bit harsh when it comes to any of this, but you'll have to let me know what you think down below, because honestly, I don't know if I'm alone in this, and I really would like to see other perspectives on the matter, because I think it's worth discussing. So, in any case, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.